The clerk asked her to state her name for the record, and for a single heartbeat, she could not, because the child in her arms had chosen that exact moment to open her eyes. Small, unfocused, the color of rained-on slate, Eleanor Vance looked down at her daughter and felt the courtroom recede. The oiled benches and the low murmur and the long shaft of winter light from the high window all folding back like a curtain drawn aside. Then she lifted her chin and spoke. Eleanora Margaret Vance, formerly Duchess of Halverston. The clerk wrote it down without looking up. Somewhere behind her, a fan snapped open and shut. She had 7 minutes, by the pocket watch of the barrister to her left, before the doors were closed and the proceeding began. And in those 7 minutes, she had to decide whether she would speak the truth she had carried in silence for 11 months, or whether she would let the polished machinery of the law simply grind her flat and be done with it. The baby's hand found the edge of her shawl and closed around it with astonishing certainty. That was answer enough for the moment. Eleanora shifted her weight, adjusted the sleeping wrap, and looked, at last, across the aisle. He was already there. Adrian, 6th Duke of Halverston, sat with a stillness that other men mistook for indifference. She knew better. She had watched him sit that way in 3 different rooms across 4 years of a marriage she had believed once to be a quiet partnership, and she had learned that his stillness was the stillness of a man deciding which of several thoughts to permit himself. His hands were folded in his lap. His coat was the dark greenish-black of a wet river stone. He did not look at her. He looked instead at the empty seat beside him. Someone had draped a pale gray pelisse across the back of it. Someone had set a small enameled reticule on the cushion. Someone had, quite plainly, saved that seat for a person who had not yet arrived. And the person, quite plainly, was not the Duke's counsel, who sat on his other side with a stack of documents and an expression of professional patience. Eleanora felt her spine adjust, 1 degree, imperceptible to any observer but herself. So, he had brought her. He had not merely brought her, he had reserved her a place. He had made it a scene before the scene began. Somewhere in her mind, quite calmly, as if she were noting the weather, she thought, he wants me to see her walk in. He wants the room to see her walk in. He has decided that the shape of today's story is that he arrived with his mistress at his side, and I arrived with a burden in my arms. And he believes those 2 images, held next to each other, will settle every question of who is the wounded party. She adjusted the child's blanket. She did not permit her face to change. She had been raised in a household where a woman's composure was the last coin she owned, and she had learned to spend it slowly. The baby made a small, contented sound. Not a cry. A sound like a question asked politely of the ceiling. Eleanora bent her head so that her lips almost touched the fine, damp hair at the crown of the baby's head, and she breathed in. Milk and warm wool and the faint, clean smell of the soap the nurse used at dawn. She held that breath a moment longer than she needed to. Then she straightened. Her barrister, Mr. Ashe, a thin, dry man who had been recommended to her by the only friend she had left in London, leaned close and murmured, "They will call the matter in perhaps 4 minutes. Are you well?" She said, "I am well." He said, "You know that you are not required to hold her. There is a woman just outside." She said, "I know." He said nothing further. He was a clever enough man to understand that she had not brought the child in her arms in order to be pitied. She had brought the child in her arms because the child was, in the eyes of the law of this country, and in the eyes of every person who would ever whisper about her at a supper table, the entire question. And she wanted the entire question to have a face. A very small, very unfocused face, with slate gray eyes that had, she was quite sure, not yet decided what color they meant to be. The door at the back of the courtroom opened. Eleonora did not turn. The rustle of the room, the small collective shift of shoulders and fans, told her everything she needed to know. She counted, silently, the seconds between the sound of the door and the sound of the footsteps reaching the aisle. 9. Slow steps, deliberate ones. The steps of a woman who had been coached, or who had coached herself, to walk into a room as if she owned the air in it. Adrian rose, only slightly, only the smallest suggestion of a courtesy, the way one might half rise for a favored cousin. But he rose, and he did it in a courtroom, in front of the bench, in front of the clerk, in front of Eleonora, and the message was legible in every language spoken in that building. Then the woman was past her, and Eleonora let herself look, only a glance. A profile, gloved hand lifting the police aside, an ostrich feather nodding once as she sat. Younger than Eleonora had allowed herself to picture. Not by much. Enough. A mouth arranged for the occasion, a jaw that carried, Eleonora noticed with a kind of distant, cataloging precision. A small, unhappy tension, as if the owner of that jaw had not, in fact, wanted to be here, but had been persuaded that being here was the price of what came next. Interesting. Eleonora looked away. The baby made another small, thoughtful sound. Mr. Ashe leaned in again. I must ask you once more, madam, before they call us. Do you wish to introduce, at the appropriate moment, the letter? Eleonora did not answer immediately. She looked at the empty air above the bench. She looked at the tall, sooty window, and the way the winter light fell across the wooden rail in a single clean bar. She thought of a small stone chapel on the edge of a village whose name she had not spoken aloud in almost a year. She thought of a bell that had been rung at an odd hour. She thought of a page torn from a parish register and folded 3 times and slipped into the lining of a traveling case, and of the hand that had done the tearing, and of the color of that hand's cuff. Then she said, quietly, "Not yet." Mr. Ashe inclined his head. He was, mercifully, a man who could hear the word, yet. She had rehearsed this morning in her head for 11 months, and none of the rehearsals had prepared her for the smell of the courtroom. It smelled of coal smoke and old varnish, and the faintly medicinal tang of the beeswax someone had used, badly, to polish the front rail. It smelled, underneath, of men who had been in the same clothes since breakfast. She had always found that the world, at its most consequential, smelled, in the end, disappointingly ordinary. She let the ordinariness steady her. Ordinary rooms held ordinary decisions. This was only a room. The bench was called into session. The judge, a broad man with a face like a well-thumbed book, arranged his papers and inquired, in the tone of a man discharging a duty he had discharged too many times to find fresh, whether the parties were present and prepared. Adrian's counsel rose. He was present, he said, and prepared, on behalf of His Grace the Duke of Halverston, to seek dissolution of the marriage on grounds already lodged with the court, and to seek, further, an order concerning the guardianship of the infant. Mr. Ashe rose. Mrs. Vance, he said, using the surname she had asked to be addressed by, is present, and contests both petitions. The judge glanced from one bench to the other. His eyes rested, for a fraction longer than protocol required, on the child in Eleonora's arms. Then on the empty police-draped seat that was no longer empty. Then on Adrian. His expression did not change, but Eleonora, who had spent 4 years reading the faces of men who were trained to be unreadable, saw a small dry weather pass across it. He said, "We will proceed." There was a rustle of paper. Adrian's counsel began. He spoke in the smooth, unbrave voice of a man who had said these things in these rooms 100 times. The marriage of His Grace and Mrs. Vance had, he regretted to inform the court, become insupportable. There had been, he said, in language chosen with great care and no truth, a want of candor on the wife's part. There had been, he said, question as to the paternity of the infant now present. There had been, he said, arrangements made by Mrs. Vance which His Grace had discovered only lately and which had rendered continuation of the marriage impossible. He said all of this without raising his voice. He said all of this without once glancing at the child. Eleonora listened. She heard each sentence twice, the way one hears a distant bell over water, once as the sound arrived, and once as it settled. She noted the phrase, want of candor, and thought dryly that this was true, though not in the direction he intended. She noted the phrase, question as to paternity, and felt the child in her arms sigh in sleep against her collarbone. She noted the phrase, arrangements made by Mrs. Vance, and understood with a clarity that surprised her by its calm that he was going to accuse her of the very thing he had done. She let her eyes drift once to the woman beside Adrian. The woman was looking straight ahead. Her gloved hands rested one atop the other in her lap. Her mouth was still arranged, but Eleonora saw the faint tightening at the corner of her eye when the phrase, question as to paternity, was said, and she thought, oh, my dear. So he has not told you either. So you also thought this was going to be a simpler morning than it is. The counsel finished. He sat. The judge said, Mr. Ashe? Mr. Ashe rose. He was not a tall man, and he did not attempt to appear taller. He said, My lord, before we address the specifics of the petitioner's grounds, I would beg the court's indulgence to establish, for the record, a small matter of chronology, as it will bear upon everything that follows. The judge said, Proceed. Mr. Ashe said, On the 16th of March last year, my client left the country residence of His Grace at Halverston Park in circumstances which the petitioner has today characterized as flight. My client characterizes them differently. On that morning, my client had been informed by the household steward, without His Grace's knowledge, of an arrangement that had been made, some months prior, concerning her person. He paused. He did not look at Eleonora. He looked at Adrian. He said, The arrangement in question, my lord, was a settlement of an annuity upon a lady not then, and not now, His Grace's lawful wife, secured against a portion of my client's marriage settlement. Silence. It was, Eleonora thought, a particular kind of silence. A courtroom silence had a texture. This one felt like held breath. The judge's pen stopped moving. He did not look up. He said, quietly, Is that assertion substantiated? Mr. Ashe said, It is, my lord, by a copy of the deed, executed on the 11th of January of last year, which we will introduce in due course. There was, at the Duke's bench, a small movement. Not from Adrian. Adrian did not move. The counsel beside him leaned in and murmured. Adrian's face did not change. The woman beside Adrian, however, turned her head 1 degree toward him. Only one. Enough for Eleonora, watching from across the aisle, to see the muscle in her jaw jump once. So she had not known. Eleonora had wondered. Now she knew. The judge said, We will hear the petitioner's grounds in full, and then we will consider that matter in its place. Mr. Ashe inclined his head and sat. He did not glance at Eleonora. He did not need to. She understood him perfectly. He had planted a very small, very quiet flag on a piece of ground that Adrian had not thought to defend, and everything else this morning would happen in the shadow of it. The baby stirred. Eleonora shifted her arm and murmured, without lowering her head, a sound that was not quite a word. The baby settled. She let her eyes rest, for a beat, on the pale gray pelisse folded across the back of the seat that had been saved. Someone had saved a seat for a mistress. Someone else, Eleonora thought, had saved a receipt. She had been 18 years old the first time she saw Adrian Halverston, and even then she had understood that a man like that came into a room the way a tide came into a bay. Without announcement, entirely on his own schedule, altering the level of everything without appearing to move at all. This was not a courtroom detail. It was an old detail that surfaced in her mind now with the courtesy of a well-trained memory presenting itself at the correct moment. She let it come. It steadied her. She had been standing at the edge of a music room in a house in Bath, holding a glass of ratafia she did not intend to drink, because the ratafia had been pressed on her by a woman who wished to keep her occupied while her elder sister was married off in the next room to a man twice her age. Eleonora, whose only inheritance was a small parcel of land in Sussex that produced barley and opinions in roughly equal measure, had understood already that no one intended to arrange a match for her. She was the second daughter of a modest baronet with an expensive cousin. She was clever, which was a private disadvantage. She was neat, which was a public virtue. She was, above all, quiet, which meant that people forgot she was in the room and said things in front of her that they would not have said in front of a more decorative woman. Adrian had come into the music room looking for a friend and had found, instead, Eleonora at the window, reading, without embarrassment, the label on the back of a botanical print because there was nothing else to read. He had asked her what the print said. She had told him. He had asked her what she thought of it. She had told him. He had, and this was the part her memory had never quite forgiven itself for, laughed. Not at her, at what she had said. It had been a small, surprised, unrehearsed laugh, and she had understood, standing there in a dress that had been remade twice from her sister's cast-offs, that she had just committed the private and irretrievable error of being interested in a man who would remember her. 6 months later, he had asked her father for her. Her father, who had expected to spend the year unloading her onto a country parson with poor teeth, had nearly fainted. Her mother had wept. Her elder sister had written a letter of congratulation that could, if one held it up to the light, be read as a curse. Eleonora had accepted, not because she was in love, though she suspected she might in time be, but because Adrian had seemed to her to be that rare and dangerous thing, a man who noticed. She had believed then that being noticed by such a man was a form of safety. She had been, in this, young. In the courtroom, she permitted the memory to close, gently, and stepped back into the present. Adrian's counsel had resumed. He was, now, laying out with great delicacy the manner in which His Grace had come to entertain doubts as to the fidelity of his wife. There had been, he said, a period of some months during which Mrs. Vance had traveled unaccompanied to Sussex, ostensibly to attend to the affairs of a distant cousin. But in truth, he said, and here he took a small, well-timed breath, in the company of a gentleman whose name it was not necessary at this juncture to speak, though the court would understand it could be produced. Eleonora did not move. She had known this was coming. Mr. Ashe had warned her. Even so, hearing it said aloud, in a room full of men who did not know her, was a particular sensation. It felt, she thought with dry accuracy, like being coldly and precisely undressed by a stranger who had never touched her. She kept her face still. The baby, mercifully, slept. Adrian's counsel proceeded. Upon returning from the said journey, he said, Mrs. Vance had informed His Grace that she was with child. His Grace, he said, had received this news with the felicity and duty proper to a husband. It was only later, he said, that certain particulars had come to His Grace's attention, which had rendered his felicity, sadly, ill-founded. He did not specify the particulars. He did not need to. The listener was invited to imagine. That, Eleonora understood, was the whole method. Leave a shape in the air and let the room fill it with the worst thing it could think of. She permitted herself, for the first time that morning, one small internal act of anger. Not visible, not audible, just a single clean interior clenching of the hand of her mind around a fact. The fact was this. The child in her arms had been conceived in the bedroom of Halverston Park, in the 3rd week of April of the previous year, at approximately 10:30 in the evening, following a supper at which Adrian had drunk 1 glass of hock and had, uncharacteristically, spoken at some length about a horse he intended to buy. She remembered the horse's name. She remembered the color of his cuffs. She remembered which side of the bed she had slept on and which side she had not. She remembered, because she had, from that night onward, kept a small book. Not a diary. A ledger, a quiet, dated, factual ledger of her own life, because some instinct she had not yet been able to name had told her, that spring, that a woman in her position had best keep records. She had not shown the ledger to Mr. Ashe. She had not decided yet whether she would. It sat, at this moment, wrapped in oilcloth, at the bottom of a hat box in the room she had taken above a milliner's shop in a street she did not intend anyone in this courtroom to ever learn the name of. Adrian's counsel finished his second passage and sat. There was a pause. The judge wrote. The clerk wrote. Somewhere in the gallery a woman coughed politely into a handkerchief. Mr. Ashe rose. My lord, he said, my client wishes, before we address the substance of the petitioner's assertions, to make one small request. The judge said, and that is? Mr. Ashe said, that she be permitted to hand the infant to her nurse, who waits in the corridor, so that the remainder of this proceeding may be conducted without disturbance to the child. The judge glanced again at the baby. He nodded. Granted, he said. Mr. Ashe turned to Eleonora. She stood. She walked at an unhurried pace along the aisle. She did not look at Adrian. She did not look at the woman. She looked only at the door. Outside in the paneled corridor, the nurse was waiting on a bench with a folded shawl across her knees and the pale, patient face of a woman who had been told very little and had asked for even less. Eleonora bent, kissed the crown of her daughter's head, and transferred the small, warm weight into the nurse's arms. The baby made her polite question sound again. The nurse murmured back to her an answer only babies understood. Eleonora straightened. She stood for a moment in the corridor, looking not at the child but at a point on the wall above the nurse's shoulder, and permitted herself 3 long, silent breaths. On the 3rd, she turned and went back inside. When she resumed her seat, her arms felt strangely light, as if the child had weighed something more than her body. She folded her hands in her lap in the exact posture she had once been taught to fold them in for portraits. She looked at the bench. She waited. Mr. Ashe began his case with an almost tedious calm, which was, Eleonora had come to understand, his particular kind of violence. He did not raise his voice. he did not gesture. He asked the court's leave to establish, in orderly fashion, 3 points. First, the character and conduct of his client during the period of her marriage. Second, the character and conduct of the arrangement referenced earlier, namely, the annuity settled upon a lady not the petitioner's lawful wife. Third, the true circumstances of the journey to Sussex that the petitioner's counsel had, with such creative economy, described. The judge said, "Proceed." "Mr. Ashe said, upon the character and conduct of my client during the marriage, I shall call, in due course, 3 witnesses. The housekeeper of Halverston Park, who has been in service there for 22 years and served 2 duchesses before my client. The parish priest of the village of Halverston, who received my client's confession in the plain sense of confidences and not the sacramental sense, on more occasions than he can readily count. And the physician who attended my client through the greater part of her confinement." The judge wrote. Adrian's counsel rose. "My lord," he said, "we do not contest the character of Mrs. Vance in the general. We contest a specific act." Mr. Ashe smiled, very slightly. Then he said, "My lord, I shall spend the court's time on the specific act." He turned, at last, to the papers on the small table before him. He selected one. He said, "My lord, on the 11th of January last year, at the offices of Messrs. Broughton and Kell in Chancery Lane, a deed was executed by which His Grace of Halverston settled upon one Miss Cordelia Merivale, spinster, an annuity of £600 per annum, secured, as I stated earlier, against a portion of my client's marriage settlement." He paused. He allowed the name to sit in the air. Eleanora did not turn her head. She did not need to. She had, that morning, made a private wager with herself as to whether the woman beside Adrian would flinch at the sound of her own name spoken in a courtroom. Eleanora had wagered that she would not, because a woman coached to walk in the way she had walked in would have been coached to receive her own name in public without a flicker. Eleanora had won her wager. Cordelia Merivale did not flinch, but she did. Eleanora saw from the corner of her eye, close her hands 1 degree more tightly around each other. Mr. Ashe continued. "Miss Merivale," he said, "is not and never has been married to His Grace. She is not a widow of a friend or relative. She is not a distant cousin in reduced circumstances. She is, my lord, a lady with whom His Grace has maintained an association of some years' standing, beginning, according to a letter which we shall introduce, some 18 months prior to his marriage to my client, and continuing without interruption thereafter." The judge's pen paused. Mr. Ashe said, "My client learned of the settlement, as I have said, on the 16th of March last year, when the household steward, believing that the matter had by then been disclosed to her by His Grace, and concerned that certain rents from her Sussex property were being redirected in service of the annuity, brought the matter to her directly. My client was, at that time, in the 8th week of a pregnancy of which His Grace was aware, and which he had greeted, as his own counsel has just informed the court, with felicity and duty." Eleanora kept her hands folded. She kept her face composed. She thought, briefly and precisely, of the morning of the 16th of March, and of the steward's face, and of the small pot of hyacinths on the sill of the breakfast room, and of how she had gone on eating a piece of toast for a full minute after he had finished speaking, because she had not, at that moment, been able to think of anything else to do with her hands. Mr. Ashe said, "My client did not, at that time, confront His Grace. My client left Halverston Park within 36 hours. She traveled, unaccompanied by any gentleman, to the parish of her late maternal aunt in Sussex, where she remained through the birth of her daughter, in the care of her aunt's household, and under the attendance of a physician whose name and testimony we will produce." He paused. He said, "The gentleman whom His Grace's counsel has implied accompanied my client on this journey did not, in fact, accompany her. He was, at the dates in question, in Edinburgh, in the service of the Board of Excise, a fact which is a matter of public record and which we will demonstrate by production of the relevant returns." The room did something small. Not a gasp, nothing so vulgar. A shift, a recalibration. The kind of shift a room makes when it realizes that it has been invited, moments earlier, to imagine a very particular kind of story, and now it is being told, with documentation, that the story is not available. Eleanora did not look at Adrian. She was, at that moment, more curious about the judge. The judge's face had not changed, but he was writing more slowly. She had spent enough time around men of consequence to know that when a busy man's pen slowed, he was making room in his mind for a fact he had not expected to have to accommodate. Adrian's counsel rose. "My lord," he said, "this is a great deal of assertion. Where is the documentation?" Mr. Ashe said, "My lord, with the court's permission, I would prefer to introduce the documents in an order that preserves the coherence of my client's account, rather than piecemeal at the interruption of my learned friend. But if the court prefers, I shall produce the deed of settlement now." The judge said, "Produce it." Mr. Ashe produced it. He handed a folded document to the clerk, who handed it to the judge. The judge unfolded it. He read. He did not lift his eyes from it for what Eleanora estimated to be 42 seconds. She counted, because counting was one of the things she did with her mind when the alternative was to feel. When he had finished reading, he folded the document, placed it beside his other papers, and looked, without expression, at Adrian's counsel. He said, "We will proceed." Adrian's counsel sat. Adrian himself, Eleanora noticed at last, had turned his head one small degree toward the woman beside him. Not to look at her, to position his ear, she thought, so that if she chose to say anything to him, however quietly, he would hear it. The woman said nothing. That, Eleanora thought, was itself an answer. Mr. Ashe said, "My lord, I turn now to the matter of the infant." There was, at that word, a small, human, involuntary movement from Adrian. Not from his face, from his hand. His right hand, which had been folded in his lap, opened once, and then closed again. Eleanora saw it. She was certain that no one else in the courtroom saw it. She was, in that moment, more certain of the meaning of that small movement than she had been of anything else that had passed between them in the last 11 months. She filed it away. She would consider it later. Mr. Ashe said, "My client has been accused, by implication, of infidelity, and the infant, now in the care of her nurse in the corridor, has been described as being of doubtful paternity. My client denies this in the plainest terms. My client asserts, and will testify under oath, that the child was conceived at Halverston Park in the ordinary course of the marriage, in the week following the 20th of April last year, and that His Grace was the sole and only person present with her on the night in question." He paused. He said, "We will not, my lord, ask the court to arbitrate between the memory of my client and the assertions of His Grace's counsel on that point alone. We will produce, with the court's leave, a further document, which I will describe when the moment comes." Eleanora felt, deep beneath the composure she had spent the morning constructing, a small cold sensation, as if a window in a far room of her mind had been opened. She had told Mr. Ashe of the ledger. She had not told him of the letter. He was not, she realized now, referring to the ledger. He was referring to something else. She looked at him. He did not look at her. She trusted him. She had chosen him because she trusted him. But there was, evidently, one more piece on the board that she had not yet been shown. The judge said, "We shall adjourn for 1 hour. Bailiff, kindly clear the well of the court." There was the small, orderly commotion of a courtroom being paused. Papers were tied. Coats were shrugged into. The gallery, denied its refreshment, sighed. Eleanor rose. She did not look toward Adrian's bench. She walked to the door with Mr. Ashe at her elbow and did not permit her heels to sound louder on the boards than was strictly necessary. In the corridor, the nurse was rocking the baby in a slow, patient sway. The baby was awake now, wide-eyed and grave, as if she had been listening through the walls and had opinions. Eleanor took her back into her arms without a word. The nurse curtsied and withdrew tactfully to a bench at the far end of the corridor. "Mr. Ashe said, 'Madam, we should speak.'" Eleanor said, "We should." He guided her to a small oak-paneled room off the corridor that smelled of ink and cold tea. He closed the door. He set his papers on the table. He said, "First, are you well?" She said, "I am functioning." He said, "That will suffice. Second, I owe you an explanation." She said, "You referred to a document I have not seen." He said, "Yes." She said, "Tell me." He sat opposite her. He said, "Madam, when you first came to me, you gave me a great many facts and one instruction. The instruction was that under no circumstances was I to introduce, in this courtroom, the letter that had been sent to you in September by a woman calling herself Miss Merivale's maid, unless I could see no other way to save your daughter." Eleanor said, "I remember." He said, "I have, this morning, seen no other way." She was silent for a long moment. She looked at the baby, who was studying the corner of the ceiling with great seriousness. She said, "Tell me what you propose." He said, "The letter, as you know, states that Miss Merivale, in October of last year, in the presence of her maid, spoke in some distress of a conversation she had held with His Grace, in which His Grace acknowledged the child now in your arms as his own, and undertook to secure the child's future by means which he did not, at that time, wish to disclose to you." Eleanor said, "Yes." He said, "The letter further states that Miss Merivale, on that same occasion, said in the maid's hearing that His Grace intended to seek dissolution of his marriage on grounds of the wife's infidelity, in order that he might then, at leisure, provide for both mother and child, through means less scandalous than an open acknowledgement." Eleanor said, "Yes." He said, "The letter is written in the maid's hand. It is signed. It is dated. It is corroborated in one small but very telling particular. It names the specific ribbon Miss Merivale wore on the day in question, a lilac ribbon, which we can, if necessary, establish through the milliner's book. It is, in short, admissible, and if introduced under oath, it will destroy the petitioner's case on paternity, and, I suspect, on cause." Eleanor said, "And it will destroy Miss Merivale." He said, "Yes, it will." She was quiet. He said, "Madam, I am aware that you have, from the beginning, been reluctant to injure her. I have not asked why. I do not need to. But I must ask now whether you are willing, in the light of what has been said this morning, to permit me to introduce it." Eleanor looked at her daughter. Her daughter looked back, with the slate-gray, unfocused certainty of a person who had not yet been told that the world contained categories such as scandal and paternity and public ruin. Eleanor thought, quite clearly, that she had spent 11 months trying to end this without destroying anyone but Adrian, and that she had failed, and that failing was, in the end, a kind of information. She said, "Mr. Ashe." He said, "Madam." She said, "I will not introduce the letter." He said, "Madam." She said, "Hear me." He waited. She said, "I will not introduce the letter because Miss Merivale is not, in fact, the author of my injury. She is a woman who was, I believe, promised things by a man who intended to give her only some of them. She has today walked into a courtroom on the arm of that man, believing, I think, that she was walking into her own future, and she is discovering, without turning her head, that she was walking into someone else's mourning. If I destroy her today, I do his last piece of work for him. I would rather not." She paused. She said, "But I will do this. If, in the course of the afternoon, His Grace's counsel presses the assertion of infidelity to the point of a verdict, you will, at the last available moment, indicate to the court that a further document exists, that it bears materially upon paternity, and that my client is willing to submit it to the court in private, at the court's discretion, rather than upon the public record. If the court accepts, we will hand the letter to the judge alone. If the court refuses, we will withdraw the offer, and I will testify." She looked at him. She said, "Is that possible?" Mr. Ashe considered. He said, "It is unusual. It is, however, within the court's discretion. And this particular judge, madam, is a man who prefers to see truth reach the record without more damage than the record requires. He may accept." She said, "Then that is what we will do." He said, "Madam, may I say?" She said, "You may." He said, "That is a merciful strategy. I have not often, in this room, been asked to be merciful." Eleonora said, "I am not asking you to be merciful. I am asking you to be exact." He inclined his head. He said, "Then exact I shall be." She said, "One more thing." He said, "Madam." She said, "I would like 10 minutes alone with my daughter before we go back in." He rose. He said, "Of course." He gathered his papers. At the door, he paused. He said, "Madam, may I ask you a question that I have wondered since I took your case?" She said, "You may." He said, "When you first came to me, you did not weep. You did not, at any point in the retelling of what had been done to you, permit yourself even a change of color. I have wondered how." Eleonora looked at him. She said, "Mr. Ashe?" He said, "Madam." She said, "I was raised to understand that a woman's composure is the last coin she owns." He said, "And?" She said, "I have been spending it very slowly." He inclined his head. He went out. She sat, alone, in the paneled room. The baby, now warm and awake and in her mother's arms, looked up at her and, for the first time all morning, made a sound that was not a polite question. It was a small, contented, deliberate coo, as if to say, "I have been listening. I have understood as much as I can. I am with you." Eleonora bent her head. She permitted, at last, a single tear to slide from her right eye. It fell onto the baby's blanket. The baby did not notice. Eleonora wiped her cheek with the back of her hand and, quietly, in a voice too low for anyone but the child to hear, said, "My darling, my darling, we will be all right." They resumed at 2:30. The light had shifted. The single clean bar across the wooden rail had moved perhaps 6 inches to the left. Eleonora had returned the baby to the nurse in the corridor. She had washed her face in a basin of cold water. She had folded her hands. She was, once again, composed. Adrian's counsel opened the afternoon with a small tactical concession. He said, "My lord, on reflection, His Grace does not wish to press the specific assertion regarding the gentleman in Edinburgh. That assertion had been made in reliance on information which His Grace now understands to have been imperfect. He begs the court's pardon for its introduction." Mr. Ashe, beside Eleonora, did not smile, but she felt, without looking, the small settling of his shoulders that meant he was pleased. Adrian's counsel continued. "Nevertheless, my lord," he said, "His Grace maintains that the marriage is insupportable and that the paternity of the infant is in doubt, and he asks the court to grant dissolution and guardianship on those bases." He then spoke for some 15 minutes about the general reputation of Halverston Park, about His Grace's public duties, about the necessity of an orderly succession, about the importance to the county of a settled ducal household. Eleonora listened. She thought, dryly, that a man who wished to be believed on the subject of an infant's paternity ought perhaps to have avoided, for the space of a single afternoon, a 15-minute panegyric on the importance of orderly succession. But she did not smile. Mr. Ashe rose in response. He was brief. He said, "My lord, my client does not dispute the importance of an orderly succession. She disputes, however, the necessity of achieving it at the expense of the child now in the corridor of this court. That child, my lord, was born in wedlock, and is, by every presumption of law available to your lordship, the lawful daughter of the petitioner. The petitioner, in seeking to displace that presumption, has offered this court innuendo, retracted assertions, and, my lord, a saved seat. Every head in the courtroom, every head except Eleonora's and Adrian's, turned very slightly in the direction of the seat with the pale gray pelisse still draped across it. The judge, to his credit, did not turn his head, but his eyes, Eleonora saw, flickered once. Mr. Ashe said, "My client is prepared, my lord, if the court is willing, to place before your lordship, in private, a document which bears materially upon the question of paternity, and which will remove, in your lordship's own hand and to your lordship's own satisfaction, any doubt on that subject. My client makes this offer not from a desire to withhold from the record, but from a desire to spare the record injury it does not require." The judge looked for a long moment at Mr. Ashe. He then looked for a longer moment at Adrian. Adrian's face, Eleonora saw for the first time all day, was not entirely composed. There was a very small vertical line between his brows that she had, in 4 years of marriage, seen only twice. Once when the mare he had spent a great deal of money on had turned out to be sound of leg but wrong of temperament. Once when a letter had arrived from his mother, in the winter of their first year, on a subject he had never disclosed to Eleonora. And now. The judge said, "Mr. Ashe?" Mr. Ashe said, "My lord." The judge said, "I shall receive the document." Mr. Ashe, without looking at Eleonora, drew from within his coat a folded paper sealed with a small blob of dark red wax. He handed it to the clerk. The clerk handed it to the judge. The judge broke the seal. He read. Eleonora watched him read. She counted because it was what she did. She counted to 68. He folded the letter. He placed it beneath his other papers. He looked up. He said, "Mr. Ashe?" Mr. Ashe said, "My lord." The judge said, "The petition for dissolution on the ground of the wife's infidelity is dismissed. The petition for guardianship of the infant on the ground of doubtful paternity is dismissed. If His Grace wishes to press dissolution on other grounds, he may petition anew." The court will now hear the matter of the settlement referenced this morning and any question of restitution arising therefrom. He looked at Adrian's counsel. He said, "Does His Grace wish to be heard on the question of the settlement now, or shall we adjourn to a further date?" Adrian's counsel, after a brief and, Eleanora thought, entirely inaudible consultation with Adrian, said, "My lord, if the court is willing, we shall request adjournment to a further date." The judge said, "Granted." He said, "Mrs. Vance?" Eleanora rose. He said, "Madam, this court is satisfied of your character and of the parentage of your child. You are free to withdraw." He paused. He said, "And, madam, if I may?" She said, "My lord." He said, "The child in the corridor is a lucky child." Eleanora inclined her head. She said, "Thank you, my lord." She turned. She walked at a measured pace along the aisle. She did not, for a long moment, permit herself to look at Adrian. Then, when she was almost level with his bench, she did. He was already looking at her. His eyes, which had been, throughout the morning, the unreadable dark gray of a river stone, were now, briefly, the eyes of the young man who had once laughed at a botanical print in a music room in Bath. It lasted a second. He said nothing. She said nothing. She walked on. Beside him, Cordelia Merivale sat with her gloved hands folded and her mouth arranged and her jaw very tight. Eleanora, passing, permitted herself one small courtesy. She did not look at her. It was not, she thought later, forgiveness. It was closer to something more useful. It was a refusal to make of her a spectacle. In the corridor, the nurse rose. The baby, seeing Eleanora, stretched out one small hand and grasped, with astonishing precision, the ribbon at Eleanora's throat. Eleanora laughed. It was the first sound of laughter she had made in the building all day, and it startled her, and she thought, "Ah, so there is still that." She took her daughter into her arms. She said to the nurse, "We are going home." The nurse, who had, Eleanora suspected, been holding her breath for some hours, said only, "Yes, madam." They walked out of the building together. The winter light was low and gold on the flagstones. A carriage waited. Eleanora climbed in. As the door was closing, she looked once, briefly, back at the tall stone building she was leaving. On the top step, a woman in a pale gray pelisse had come out alone. She was standing very still, looking down at the flagstones. Beside her, the man Eleanora had once married was nowhere to be seen. Eleanora watched her for a moment. She thought, in a voice inside herself that was not unkind, "Oh, my dear, he has left you on the step." She turned her face forward. The carriage moved. The house she had taken, above the milliner's shop, was small, warm, and unfashionable, which was the whole of its virtue. It had 3 rooms, a good stove, a window that faced south, and a landlady who did not ask questions in exchange for the promise that Eleanora would not either. It was not a house a duchess would have chosen. It was, precisely, the house a woman who had been a duchess and did not intend to be one again would choose. She climbed the narrow stairs with her daughter in her arms and the nurse behind her carrying, with dignified effort, a basket, a portmanteau, and a hat box. The hat box, which was the lightest object, was the one Eleanora would not permit the nurse to set down carelessly. It contained, at its bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a ledger. On the landing, she paused. She listened. From below came the muted sound of the milliner arguing gently with a customer about the exact shade of a ribbon. From above came nothing at all. She let herself in. The rooms were as she had left them that morning. The kettle on the stove, the basket of clean linen by the window, the small vase of dried lavender on the mantel. She set the baby down in the wooden cradle she had, with the last of a discreet advance from Mr. Ashe, purchased from a carpenter in the next street. She removed her bonnet. She sat in the one good chair. For a full minute she did not move. Then she stood, went to the stove, put on the kettle, and began to unpin her hair. She would not, she thought, have believed on the 16th of March last year that she would ever again unpin her hair without her hand shaking. She was doing it now. Slowly, precisely, without hurry. That, she thought, was information also. That evening, when the baby was asleep and the nurse had gone to her own small room across the landing, Eleonora sat by the stove with a cup of weak tea and permitted herself, for the first time all day, to think properly about Adrian. She did not think about him with anger. She had, she found, spent all the anger she could afford in the courtroom, and there was none left tonight. She thought about him instead with a kind of quiet, curious attention. She thought about the way his hand had opened and closed when Mr. Ashe had said the word infant. She thought about the vertical line between his brows when the judge had said, "I shall receive the document." She thought about the brief look he had given her as she passed his bench. She was not fool enough to mistake any of these things for love. She had, sometime in the last 11 months, come to understand that whatever Adrian had felt for her had been real in its way, and insufficient in every other way, and that a real, insufficient feeling was, in the end, a worse betrayal than none at all, because it required the betrayed party to spend the rest of her life wondering whether she had been unreasonable to want more. She had decided, some weeks ago, in a chair very like this one, that she would not spend her life so. She would spend it, instead, on her daughter, and on the small parcel of land in Sussex that produced barley and opinions, and on such small quiet dignities as she could still afford. Adrian had, she suspected, understood in the courtroom that he had lost. He had also understood, she thought, that she had chosen not to destroy Miss Merivale, and that the choice had been hers, not his, and not the court's. He would understand, in time, what that meant. He would understand that she had, in a sense he had never granted her during their marriage, extended him and his mistress a courtesy neither of them had extended to her. He would understand that this was not a gift. It was a boundary. It said, "I will not carry you any further. Go, both of you, and be who you have chosen to be. I will be who I have chosen to be." She sipped her tea. The stove ticked. From the cradle came the small, even breath of a sleeping child. There would be, she knew, more days in courtrooms. There would be the matter of the settlement. There would be, no doubt, a dissolution on some other, tidier ground. There would be, for the rest of her life, whispers at supper tables in towns she did not intend ever to visit. There would be, most probably, no second marriage. She found that she could contemplate this without dismay. There would be, above all, a girl with slate-gray eyes that had not yet decided what color they meant to be, who would grow up in this small, warm, unfashionable set of rooms above a milliner's shop, and who would learn, from the woman who had brought her there, that composure was a coin one spent slowly, and that mercy, precisely applied, was not weakness, but a form of ownership. Eleonora finished her tea. She rose. She banked the stove. She stood for a moment over the cradle, watching her daughter sleep. She said, in a whisper meant for no one but the two of them, "Welcome home, my love." Then she went to her own bed. Outside, in the street, a lamplighter passed. His pole tapped softly against each iron post. It was a small, unnoticed, patient sound. It went on down the street and away, and at last was gone. Of the others, if you would like to know, this is where they went. Miss Cordelia Merivale did not, in the end, marry the Duke of Halverston. She did not, in the end, marry anyone she had originally intended to. She took, some 3 months after the events of that winter afternoon, a modest house in Bath, with a small annuity that had, by an arrangement neither party publicly acknowledged, been paid over to her from the Duke's private funds, rather than from the Vance settlement, the settlement having been, in the interim, restored in full to Eleanora by order of the court. Miss Merivale in Bath took up watercolors, at which she was gifted, and card parties, at which she was less so, and after some years married a widowed apothecary of gentle manners and unremarkable politics, who thought she was the most elegant woman he had ever met, and who was, in the small and useful ways that matter in a long life, entirely correct. She did not speak of the Duke. She did not speak of the courtroom. When, in later years, an acquaintance who did not know her history mentioned, at a dinner, the strange business of the Halverston divorce that had, and here the acquaintance paused, come to nothing, Miss Merivale said only, "Oh, has it?" and asked to be passed the salt. It was a small piece of composure. It cost her, one imagines, a certain amount to produce, and she had, one imagines, learned where. Adrian, 6th Duke of Halverston, did in the end obtain a dissolution of his marriage, on a ground so procedural and so uncontested that no county newspaper thought it worth more than 4 lines. He did not remarry. He returned to Halverston Park, which is a large house in a wet county, and there he took up, with a seriousness his acquaintances had not previously seen in him, the improvement of drainage on his tenant farms. He became, within a few years, a man locally admired for his understanding of soil, and locally pitied for a sadness that never quite left his face. He wrote, in the 2nd year after the dissolution, a letter to Eleanora, in which he did not ask to see her, did not ask to see the child, and did not offer explanation. He asked only that if she should ever require assistance of a kind he could provide, without her having to receive him, she would send word to a solicitor whose name he gave. Eleanora read the letter twice. She placed it, unanswered, in a locked drawer. She did not, in later years, require his assistance. She kept the letter, nevertheless. The steward of Halverston Park, whose small, unauthorized act of honesty on the 16th of March had begun the entire matter, was retained in his position, and, by a private arrangement Eleanora made with him through Mr. Ashe, received each Christmas thereafter a modest sum with a card in her own hand. The card said only, "With thanks." He kept every one of them in a tin on his mantel. The parish priest of Halverston, who had testified to Mr. Ashe's satisfaction and never been called into the box, went on doing what parish priests do, which is to attend to the small distresses of small people with such patience as God provides. He married, in his old age, a schoolmistress with a firm view of fractions, and they were very happy in the way that late marriages sometimes are. The housekeeper of Halverston Park served 2 more years, and then retired to a cottage in a village not far from the Sussex property. She wrote to Eleanora twice a year. Her letters were full of the weather and the doings of a tabby cat named Mr. Prendergast, who was, according to her account, a person of very strong opinions, and very few of them wise. Mr. Ashe, the barrister, continued to defend women whose husbands had made saved seat sorts of arrangements. He did not become famous. He became, in a smaller and more useful way, known. Certain women in certain drawing rooms, when asked whom to see, said his name quietly and moved on. He never sent Eleanora a bill for the full amount of his work. When she inquired, he said only, "Madam, there is a fund." She did not press him. She suspected the fund was, in fact, himself, and she chose to allow him this small dignity. The nurse, whose name was Mary, remained with Eleanora and the child for 11 years, at the end of which she married a widowed cabinet maker in the next street and moved, precisely, one door down. She continued to come up for tea most afternoons. The child, whose name was, when she was old enough to be given one, Iris, grew up in the rooms above the milliner's shop until she was 7, at which point Eleanora, having reordered the affairs of the Sussex property to her own liking, took her there. Iris grew up on that parcel of land that produced barley and opinions, and she inherited, in due course, both. She was a girl of quiet composure and unexpected humor, with slate-gray eyes that had, by the age of 5, decided at last on a very dark and thoughtful blue. She never met her father. She knew from an early age that he existed. Eleanora had, when Iris was old enough, told her the essential facts, without ornament and without bitterness, because Eleanora had understood that a child who is told the truth in a plain voice will learn to trust plain voices. Iris asked, when she was 12, whether her mother had ever been sorry. Eleanora considered. She said, "No, my love, not for you, not for a single day." That, in the end, was all that Iris needed to know. And Eleanora herself, in the years that followed, became, in her own quiet, unadvertised way, the sort of woman other women wrote to when they did not know whom else to write to. She answered every letter. She kept above her writing desk a small enamel plate with a single dried sprig of lavender on it, from the vase that had stood on the mantel of the rooms above the milliner's shop. She did not display the ledger. She did not destroy it either. It sat, wrapped in oilcloth, at the bottom of a hat box in a cupboard in Sussex, where it stayed, unread and undisturbed, for the rest of her long, ordinary, unspectacular life. And now, my dear listener, you and I have come to the end of this story, and the fire has burned low, and the room is warm, and I thank you for staying with me through all of it. If you have ever walked into a room holding something precious, knowing that a seat had been saved against you, and stood your ground anyway, without shouting, without breaking, without becoming the thing that was being done to you, then you already know Eleanora, and she, in a sense, already knows you. I would like, before I bank the coals for the night, to ask you something. Which moment stayed with you? Was it the small movement of a hand opening and closing in a courtroom? Was it a lilac ribbon named in a maid's careful letter? Was it a woman who chose to be exact rather than merciful, and by being exact turned out to be merciful after all? Was it a stove ticking in a warm room above a milliner's shop, and a lamplighter's pole tapping softly down an emptying street? Tell me. I like to know which pieces of a story travel home with the listener, because those, I think, are the pieces that were meant for you. If you would like to sit by this fire again and hear another quiet story told slowly and told kindly, you are welcome to pull up your chair whenever you wish. There will always be a seat here saved for you, and it will not be saved against anyone. It will only be saved for you. Rest well tonight, my friend. Sleep gently. I will see you by the fire next time.